Imagine this. You're lying in bed at 2:37 a.m., staring at the ceiling as a silent war rages inside your skull. You've solved problems others can't even see. You've read the books, asked the hard questions, mapped the stars of human thought, and yet you're paralyzed by something that doesn't make logical sense, a deep, gnawing emptiness. Not because anything is wrong, but because everything might be too right. You've optimized your life, but joy remains a ghost. People call you brilliant, insightful, gifted. But beneath the applause, you carry a secret. The more you understand, the heavier it becomes to exist. You try to explain it, once. Maybe to a friend, maybe a lover. You say, it's like, I see too much. I know too much. And none of it feels enough. They tilt their head and smile, confused. You think too much, they say, as if that's a solution. As if your mind is a faucet you can just turn off. As if they understand what it's like to see the fragile strings holding reality together and wonder why everyone else seems content to pretend they're not unraveling. What they don't see, what you can't unsee, is the paradox. The smarter you are, the more clearly you see life's absurdity. The contradictions. The suffering. The small talk, the empty rituals, the illusions people cling to just to make it through another day. And worst of all, you see yourself, your flaws, your fears, your endless internal monologue dissecting every thought like a scientist studying a dying star. Have you noticed it? The pattern hiding in plain sight? Some of the most intelligent people in history, poets, scientists, philosophers, ended their lives in despair. Others faded into silence, isolation, addiction. Not because they were weak, but perhaps because they were awake. Think of Sylvia Plath, David Foster Wallace, Virginia Woolf, Alan Turing. The ones who couldn't look away. Why is it that with greater mental clarity often comes emotional disintegration? Is intelligence a gift, or a curse? Imagine having the ability to see the full spectrum of human behavior, to anticipate consequences before they happen, to trace pain back to its origin like a forensic detective of the soul, yet being unable to stop feeling it all, deeply and constantly. Imagine seeing the world not just for what it is, but for what it could be, and realizing the unbearable chasm between the two. You walk through life noticing the things others miss, the hollow smile of the barista who always says she's doing great, the way your colleague's laugh carries a tremor of loneliness, the existential ache in the eyes of the man who feeds the pigeons alone every morning. You see these things because your mind is sharp, perceptive, but the sharper the mind, the more it cuts inward. And so, you carry it. A quiet burden. You tell yourself you should be happy. You have every reason to be. You've figured it out. But happiness, for some reason, doesn't respond to logic. You dissect it, diagnose it, write about it, philosophize it, but it remains elusive. Like chasing smoke with a scalpel. Is it possible that intelligence, when left untethered, turns against its host? Maybe you've felt it, the sensation that you're playing a part in a play everyone else is taking seriously, but you can't stop noticing the wires, the props, the shaky set pieces. Maybe you've wondered why the more aware you become, the harder it is to laugh at jokes, to make small talk, to just relax. Maybe you've looked in the mirror and asked yourself the question you're afraid to say aloud. What if the very thing that makes you brilliant is also what's breaking you? And here's the haunting part, you're not alone. There are others like you, scattered across cities, trapped in glass towers of their own minds, haunted by awareness. People who think in constellations, who feel in earthquakes. Who lie awake not because something is wrong, but because everything is a little too real. But no one talks about this. No one warns you that knowledge, when amassed without anchoring, becomes a weight. That perception, when honed too sharply, starts to cut through the illusion of meaning itself. What happens when you see too much, but can't turn it off? What happens when your mind becomes your own most dangerous companion? What happens when intelligence meets existential despair and loses? These aren't questions for textbooks. These are the questions that visit at 3 a.m. These are the questions smart people carry silently, invisibly, every single day. And the truth is more unnerving than you might expect. Because buried beneath this quiet epidemic lies a force no one warns you about, a psychological and philosophical undertow that drags the brightest minds into the darkest waters. You've felt it. Now it's time to face it. But first, you must understand what you're truly up against. Let's begin with a strange, unsettling truth. The world was not built for the deeply intelligent. At least, not in the way it pretends to be. You were taught that intelligence would liberate you. That insight was a form of power. That if you just understood enough, read the right books, asked the right questions, got the right degrees, you'd reach a kind of inner peace, an intellectual nirvana. But you didn't. In fact, the more you learned, the more fractured things became. Why? Because intelligence, especially the kind that sees beneath surfaces, is not just a tool, it's a mirror. And the clearer that mirror becomes, the harder it is to ignore the truths it reflects. Carl Jung once said, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." He understood that to reach toward the light of understanding, one must also come face to face with darkness. And that's what the intelligent do, relentlessly. They descend. They analyze. They interrogate life, peeling back the layers of reality until they hit the raw nerve underneath. But here's the problem, most people are not prepared for what lies there. You weren't either, were you? You thought clarity would bring peace, but instead it brought depth, and depth brings weight. The more you see, the more you feel. And not just your own suffering, but the suffering of others. The absurdity. The randomness. The cosmic joke of a species building skyscrapers and launching rockets while millions can't find clean water or make meaning of their pain. Nietzsche called it the abyss. When you gaze into it long enough, it begins to gaze back. That's not a metaphor. It's a psychological reality. The more you dig into the fundamental questions of existence, why am I here? What is the point? Why do people suffer? The more you flirt with the edge of nihilism. And here is where the contradiction begins to burn. The smarter you are, the more patterns you detect. The more contradictions you notice. The more aware you become of how flimsy our systems of meaning really are. Religion, politics, culture, structures built not necessarily on truth, but on stability. We don't worship certainty because it's real, we worship it because it calms us. But intelligence doesn't let you rest there. It keeps picking, asking, peeling. And before long, you're not just learning anymore, you're unraveling. Arthur Schopenhauer saw this with terrifying clarity. He believed that human existence was rooted in what he called will, a blind, irrational force that compels all living things to strive, suffer, and repeat. For the conscious mind, this creates a dilemma. Once you become aware of the futility of it all, you begin to suffer not from external events, but from existence itself. Consciousness becomes a curse. You think deeply, therefore you suffer deeply. Viktor Frankl, who endured the unspeakable horrors of concentration camps, discovered the only antidote, meaning. Not comfort. Not pleasure. Meaning. But meaning is not something you inherit, it's something you construct. And for the highly intelligent, this construction is not easy. Because every time you try to build a truth, your mind tests its foundations and finds the cracks. So you wander. You oscillate between the desire to believe in something and the relentless instinct to question everything. You're too aware to fall asleep, and too awake to rest. You want to feel grounded, but your thoughts are wings. And wings don't touch the ground. Aldous Huxley warned that the more sensitive and intelligent a person is, the more susceptible they are to psychological collapse. Not because intelligence is pathological, but because our culture lacks the philosophical tools to support such minds. We praise intelligence, but we don't protect it. We put brilliant people in high-pressure jobs, tell them to be productive, but we don't teach them how to carry the burden of awareness. We don't tell them that seeing the world clearly is painful. That waking up comes at a cost. And so, many fall silently. They look like they have it all together. They function. They achieve. But inside, they are unraveling, not from failure, but from insight. From knowing too much, feeling too deeply, living in a culture that equates emotional stillness with strength. The truth? Depression isn't always dysfunction. Sometimes it's a reaction. A very sane response to an insane world. Jean-Paul Sartre once wrote, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself." But what if you see through the scaffolding of identity itself? What if, every time you try to become something, your mind dismantles it before it forms? You're left with a self in free fall. Not because you lack strength, but because you lack illusions. And in a world built on comforting lies, clarity is exile. You don't just see the truth, you feel the consequences of seeing it. The tragic part? No one prepared you for this. No one told you that intelligence would make you lonely. That deep insight can make you existentially isolated. That the more clearly you think, the harder it becomes to connect with those who don't. Because how do you talk about the void without sounding melodramatic? How do you admit that nothing feels meaningful without being labeled broken? How do you explain that your pain doesn't come from the world being bad, but from it being incoherent? And so, you withdraw. You build masks. You laugh at jokes you don't find funny. You nod in conversations that feel like static. You become two people, the one who plays the game, and the one who watches from above, always watching, always analyzing, never quite in it. The cost of consciousness is isolation. But not the kind others see. Not physical solitude. No, this is the deeper kind. The existential kind. The kind that makes you feel like a ghost inside your own skin. But you are not alone. There is a pattern here, a hidden problem that runs through the lives of thinkers, dreamers, and visionaries. It is the burden of awareness, the curse of insight. And it does not go away by ignoring it. It only goes away by confronting what it truly means to see. Because the question is no longer why are smart people depressed? The real question is, what happens to a society that pathologizes the pain of perception, while glorifying the blindness of denial? And what happens to those who refuse to look away? Let's go deeper. It's time to expose what this quiet suffering is really doing, not just to individuals, but to the fabric of our world. It's easy to think of this as a private affliction. A personal battle. You're in a war with meaninglessness, your isolation, your slow withdrawal from the noise of the world. But that's a mistake. What if this isn't just about you? What if this quiet suffering, the kind that dwells inside the brightest minds, has been shaping the entire structure of our society without anyone realizing it? Imagine this, a generation of brilliant, perceptive people walking through life half awake, not because they lack passion or drive, but because they've internalized a world that doesn't fit them. They've learned to silence their questions, dilute their insights, and mask their dissonance, just to survive in a culture that rewards conformity over clarity. Now imagine what's lost in that silence. This is the unseen consequence. We are building a society in which intelligence is admired on the surface, but punished at the core. A society where insight without optimism is labeled as negativity. where deep awareness is mistaken for dysfunction, where those who feel the most, question the most, and see the farthest are left to navigate their darkness alone, while being told to smile more. But the cost doesn't stop there. Let's go deeper into the architecture of the mind itself. Psychologists have long studied the link between high intelligence and what they call overexcitabilities, heightened sensitivities in areas like emotion, imagination, and cognition. These are not weaknesses. They are traits. And yet, in a culture addicted to productivity and emotional uniformity, these traits are pathologized. Imagine being a child who notices the sadness in a teacher's eyes that no one else sees. Who weeps over the death of a character in a book because the pain felt real. Who asks questions about the nature of death, God, and time before they even lose their baby teeth. Now imagine that child growing up in a world where the goal is to stop asking questions, stop feeling so much, stop being so intense. What message does that child learn? That their intelligence is dangerous. That their sensitivity is weakness. That their authenticity must be trimmed down into a socially acceptable version of themselves. This is how the trauma begins, not with overt harm, but with subtle erasure. A lifetime of micro-rejections. 1,000 moments of being too much for people who can't handle depth. And so, the mind adapts. It fragments. It compartmentalizes. It learns to think without feeling, speak without meaning, engage without revealing. It becomes functional, but numb. Externally competent, internally exiled. Cognitive dissonance sets in. This is where depression hides, not in despair, but in disconnection. The disconnection between intellect and emotion. Between who you are and who the world lets you be. Between what you know and what you're allowed to say. It's the kind of depression that doesn't look like illness. It looks like high-functioning burnout. It looks like creative paralysis. It looks like apathy masked as detachment. It looks like you, smiling politely, while your inner life collapses into static. And because you are intelligent, you build a narrative to explain it. You tell yourself it's normal. That it's just stress. That you'll feel better once the next project is done, the next book is written, the next existential hole is patched up with the illusion of progress. But deep down, you know something else is happening. You've begun to suspect that intelligence, in the absence of meaning, becomes a recursive trap. That the more you understand the mechanics of life, the less life feels alive. You analyze happiness instead of feeling it. You deconstruct love until it evaporates. You look at beauty and see the physics behind it, but the awe? That part seems to fade. Neuroscience has a term for this, cognitive diffusion. It's what happens when we become so entangled with our thoughts that we start to experience them as reality itself. For the highly intelligent, this becomes a silent prison. You no longer feel your emotions, you think them. You no longer engage in moments, you observe them. You become the analyst of your own existence. And in doing so, you slowly forget how to live it. There's a tragic irony here. The very trait that gives you the capacity for deep insight also distances you from the raw, unfiltered texture of life. The joy of music you analyzed. The comfort of conversation without self-monitoring. The awe of nature without dissecting it into cellular systems and geological timelines. And it gets worse. Because society reinforces this distance. It tells the intelligent that their value is in their utility. In their output. In their ability to solve, to fix, to improve. But what it never tells them, what it withholds, is that their inner world is worthy in itself. That their pain is not a glitch, but a signal. That their sensitivity is not a weakness, but a mirror of everything our culture refuses to confront. So they medicate it. Pathologize it. Call it overthinking, anxiety, depression. And yes, sometimes it is. But sometimes, it's something else. Sometimes it's the soul revolting against a world too shallow for its depth. Sometimes, it's a symptom of misalignment between truth and tolerance, between what the mind knows and what society permits. And this misalignment spreads. It affects institutions, relationships, art, technology. Everything becomes optimized for speed, simplicity, and surface-level understanding. We no longer make space for slow thought, for intellectual nuance, for emotional honesty. In such a world, what happens to the intelligent who refuse to play along? They retreat, or they perform, or they shatter. And the world goes on, unaware of what it's losing, the philosophers who stop speaking, the artists who stop creating, the thinkers who burn out quietly in offices, classrooms, and laboratories, too drained to fight the inertia. The cost is not just individual. It's civilizational. When society fails its most perceptive minds, it doesn't just silence them, it starves itself of vision. The people who could change everything begin to disappear into themselves. But it doesn't have to be this way. Because beneath the pain lies something else, something rare. A potential. A rebellion waiting to awaken. Not against society, but against the quiet voice that told you your depth was too much. You felt it. The flicker. The defiance. The hunger not just to survive, but to live truthfully. And now, it's time to reclaim it. There comes a point, maybe slowly, maybe all at once, when you realize that no one is coming to save you. That the world, as it stands, will not rearrange itself to make space for your sensitivity, your complexity, or your truth. And that moment, though terrifying, is sacred. Because it births rebellion. Not the loud, theatrical kind that storms streets and topples governments, though those, too, have their place. No, this rebellion begins in silence. In stillness. In the private, unlit corridors of your mind where a different kind of revolution is forged. It's the rebellion of refusing to abandon yourself in order to be acceptable. You've lived enough years in masks, worn the grin, spoken the agreeable thought, restrained the inconvenient truth. But what if the path out of your private hell isn't about silencing the noise in your head, but listening to what it's trying to tell you? What if depression, at least in its existential form, is less a malfunction and more a compass? A signal not that you're broken, but that something vital in you is rebelling against the shallow logic of the world? Nietzsche once declared, one must still have chaos in oneself to be able to give birth to a dancing star. That chaos, that discontent, it's not your enemy. It's the raw material of awakening. The crucible in which something brighter than compliance is born. The first act of rebellion is simple, but seismic. You stop apologizing for your depth. You stop pretending your questions are too much. You stop laughing at jokes that mock the very sensitivity you've fought to keep alive. You stop minimizing the enormity of what you feel just because it makes others uncomfortable. Instead, you begin the slow, radical process of reclaiming your internal authority. You stop letting society define what healthy means when its metrics are built around economic output, emotional numbing, and shallow optimism. You stop trying to be a well-adjusted person in a deeply maladjusted culture. And then, something strange happens. You begin to create. Not just in the artistic sense, though that may come too. But in the existential sense. You begin to author your own reality. To reject the passive absorption of meaning and instead construct it. Brick by brick. Breath by breath. This is what Viktor Frankl called the defiant power of the human spirit, the capacity to say yes to life in spite of everything. Not because it is easy, or beautiful, or fair, but because your very ability to choose gives life its meaning. But you must choose radically. You must choose to see yourself not as a damaged thinker, but as a seer, one who perceives what others cannot. And that vision, though painful, is also power. Consider those who came before you. The poets, the philosophers, the mystics, the scientists who dared to ask questions that shattered paradigms. They, too, suffered. But they transformed that suffering into insight. They turned their exile into vision. They didn't fit the world, so they remade it. You can too. But only if you're willing to give up the comfort of belonging in places that require your diminishment. Only if you're willing to stop trying to make your mind more palatable for others and instead make your life more aligned with your mind. That might mean fewer people. But it will mean deeper ones. It might mean less applause. But it will mean more truth. And most of all, it will mean finally feeling coherent inside your own skin. Not because you've solved every existential riddle, but because you've stopped outsourcing your worth to a culture that confuses depth with dysfunction. Let's be clear, this is not easy. Rebellion never is. You will lose things, maybe even people. You will be misunderstood. Labeled dramatic, cynical, intense, unrelatable. And every part of you conditioned to seek approval will scream. But let it scream. Because in that fire, something ancient awakens. A truth buried under layers of cultural programming and polite self-erasure. You were never meant to be normal. You were meant to disturb the comfortable illusions of the world. You were meant to feel what others deny, to see what others ignore, to speak what others are afraid to name. Your pain isn't proof that you're broken, it's proof that you're awake. And with awakening comes responsibility. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow the emptiness behind the masks. But you can choose what to do with that awareness. You can either drown in it, or use it to forge something real. Start with honesty. Start by telling the truth, even when your voice shakes. Start by naming your loneliness, your hunger for meaning, your disillusionment with surface living. Not to wallow in it, but to witness it. To bring it into the light where it loses its power to isolate you. Then, create. Not for validation. Not for perfection. But for liberation. Write the unspoken. Paint the ache. Build the thing no one asked for but you know the world needs. Start a conversation that terrifies you. Make something useless but beautiful. Find joy not in certainty, but in creation itself. That is rebellion. Because in a world that teaches intelligent people to perform instead of feel, to analyze instead of live, to suppress instead of express, every act of authentic creation is a strike against the lie. And there's one more piece. Find others. Not just friends. Allies. People who don't flinch when you speak your truth. People who carry their own questions like torches, not burdens. People who don't shrink your bigness, but fan its flames. Because no rebellion survives in isolation. When the intelligent find each other, when they stop pretending, stop performing, stop apologizing, something electric happens. They remember who they are. And more importantly, what they are for. You are not here to disappear beneath your own intelligence. You are not here to perfect your performance of normalcy. You are here to wake the sleeping, disturb the stagnant, ignite the numbed. To rebel. Not with violence, but with vision. Not with anger, but with authenticity. Not with slogans, but with soul. And when you do, when you fully step into that power, something irreversible occurs. The world doesn't change you. You begin to change the world. But to do that, you need to carry one final truth, one that reframes everything you've ever believed about pain, perception, and purpose. Are you ready to see it? You've carried your questions like weights. You've mapped the dark. You've walked the labyrinth of your mind, tracing the pattern of your pain, convinced that somewhere, deep in its center, you would find the broken part. The flaw in your code. The reason why your intelligence became a burden, why your clarity led to loneliness, why your mind couldn't stop spinning even when everything seemed fine. But what if the flaw was never in you? What if the final, most powerful realization is this? The world was never built for people who see too clearly. And that clarity, your deepest burden, is also your greatest gift. Let that sink in. Because you were taught to view your mind as a problem to solve. You were told that your inability to feel happy all the time, your tendency to overthink, your resistance to small talk, your aching need for depth, that these were symptoms of something wrong. But they weren't. They were symptoms of awareness. And awareness hurts. To see clearly is to suffer differently. To stand in a crowd and feel the hollowness of conversations that skim the surface. To witness cruelty dressed as humor, manipulation masked as success. To watch people chase pleasures that leave them emptier than before, and to know, in your bones, that something is missing. Something fundamental. So what is this final truth? It's this. The depression that so often follows intelligence is not a malfunction, it is an initiation. An initiation into reality. Not the reality of social norms and Instagram filters and 5-step happiness hacks. But the raw, unedited truth of existence, its fragility, its chaos, its aching beauty. To be truly intelligent is to be awake in a dream world. And to be awake is to suffer. At first. But then? Then you learn to see differently. Because this is what no one tells you, when you stop trying to escape your mind, when you stop treating your sadness as something to be exorcised, when you stop medicating your meaninglessness and instead face it fully, something sacred begins to stir. Not joy. Not yet. But reverence. A deep, bone-deep reverence for the complexity of life. For its tragedy and mystery. For the sheer absurdity of being conscious in a universe that owes you nothing and yet gives you everything: stars, laughter, hunger, language, music, silence, time. The depression begins to lift, not because you've solved anything, but because you've stopped demanding that life feel like a sitcom. You've stopped expecting perpetual clarity. You've made peace with contradiction. You start to feel alive not despite your pain, but through it. Because pain, when transmuted, becomes presence. Think of it like this. A less intelligent mind skims across life like a stone. But your mind, your terrible, beautiful, relentless mind, dives. It goes deep. It stays there. And the deeper you go, the more you discover what no surface dweller ever can. That beneath the pain is truth. And beneath the truth is freedom. Not the kind of freedom sold to you by self-help books. Not the manic kind promised by dopamine-chasing influencers. But a quieter freedom. A knowing. You no longer belong to the machine. You no longer measure your worth by your productivity. You no longer seek to fix your complexity just to be easier to digest. You are no longer here to fit in. You are here to illuminate. The final truth is this. Your depression wasn't the darkness. It was the light trying to break through a false self. The false self built to survive. Built to appease. Built to belong. But that self was never you. You are the one underneath. The one who cried too easily as a child. The one who stayed up at night wondering if other people also felt like actors. The one who looked at the stars and didn't feel small, but infinite. And here's the miracle: once you allow that self to speak, to live, the depression begins to lose its grip. Because the mind that once tormented you becomes an instrument of beauty. It writes. It questions. It rebels. It connects. You begin to find others. People like you, quietly carrying the same questions, the same sense of exile. And when you speak honestly, they recognize you. That is how the healing begins. Not with therapy or pills, though those can help. But with truth. With the slow, trembling act of saying, "This is who I am. I feel everything. I think too much. I see what others ignore. I suffer. I doubt. I ache. And still, I'm here." That moment is resurrection. Not from mental illness, but from spiritual amnesia. You remember that your intelligence was never the problem. The problem was forgetting what it's for. It's not for winning arguments. It's not for building resumes. It's not even for solving problems. It's for understanding. It's for witnessing. It's for holding the tension between life's unbearable sorrow and its unspeakable beauty, and choosing to love it anyway. That is what intelligent people are here to do. Not to feel good. Not to be normal. But to be alive in truth. And when you live like that, when you stop resisting your mind and start trusting it, you don't become happy in the way the world defines happiness. You become real. And in that realness, joy comes, not as a constant, but as a consequence. Not a high. Not a buzz. But a stillness. A clarity. A homecoming. And it's in that stillness that you finally understand. You were never meant to escape the dark. You were meant to walk through it. To gather its secrets. And to return bearing light. So here you are. No longer asking, "What's wrong with me?" But standing at the edge of your old self, whispering, "I remember now." And walking forward, not away from your pain, but through it. With it. Toward a life too deep for shallow joys. Toward freedom.